This radioactive uranium glass. You could look this up too, by the way. Don't take my word for it. There's about 4% of it that isn't just radioactive, it's smoking radioactive. The uranium content in it's really high. About 30 miles from here in Mount Sterling's the largest seller of radioactive uranium glass. The guy collects glassware, antique glassware. Me and my buddy, and it's a huge, it's got 2 buildings. We went through it with a Geiger counter. And, a lot of the radioactive glass, of course, which of course, this is emitting light. It's emitting gamma. People say, well, gamma, of course, is the most dangerous form of radiation. People think this stuff isn't that dangerous. This is actually that 3% or less that's actually smoking hot radioactive. We went through the whole place of all the uranium glass, thousands and thousands of pieces, tick, 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 tick. And then we came across some of this stuff, and this is one example. And it just makes the Geiger counter scream. It's way up there. One of the things that actually makes uranium unstable, of course, and fissionable, for atomic bang-bangs, is that it's a capacitance atom. The reason why right now, and of course all lead is depleted uranium after it's emitted everything it's capable of emitting. It's not uranium anymore, it's lead. It's emitting gamma radiation right now. It's a capacitance atom. It's essentially, of course, an unstable atom. And I know there's different isotopes of uranium. Some of it is fissionable. The other is essentially non-fissionable. Even though it is fissionable, it's just extremely low reactive fission such that it really wouldn't do anything. I know U-235 is supposedly the most fissionable. But the reason why it fluoresces under UV is that the atom is saying, not that it's saying anything, it's already emitting light, but it's saying, hey, I'm already at capacitance. UV is quite energetic. I mean, it's not X-ray, but the atom is telling you the reason why it's fluorescing. You get a lot of poppycock answers for why it's fluorescing. But the way to keep it simple is that the atom is at saturation for capacitance. It's already unstable. It's saying, hey, I can't take any more energy, so it encounters the UV radiation, which is light, but it's already emitting light in the form of gamma radiation, which is really, really potent and dangerous. And it's saying, I can't take it anymore, so it shoves it back out in the case of fluorescence. Let me turn on the little UV light here, and you can see the base of it, and I'll try to hold my hand up here so you could see the light, and let me turn it upside down and bring it in line with the cup. Maybe it'll fluoresce better that way. Yeah, I don't like to get this particular cup that close to my face. I love talking about light because all of quantum mechanics and relativity, by their own definition, is based upon their understanding what they think light is. And they have no idea what light is. Light is not a wave, it's not a particle, it's not a wave-particle duality. There are no dualities in nature. Light's not an emission. Light doesn't have a speed. The so-called speed of light is the rate of induction. We have a speed of sound, but sound's not an emission. It's a disturbance of the air, the oxygen and nitrogen. But we have speed of sound. All of humanity suffers the ignorant delusion that anything has a speed, of course, is moving. I'd like to talk about, because true metaphysics, I don't know how much of like Plotinus, Plato, Iamblichus, Syrianus, Proclus, this group of Neo-Pythagorean, Neoplatonists, it's all actually Greek monistic monism. There's really no sense in saying Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Neoplatonism, but we say these silly little dumb words, but nothing is known except to the modality of the knower. And true metaphysics is actually hyper-rational. It doesn't require any leap of faith. It's like you'd be reading some sort of religious text and like, well, this is completely ludicrous. I mean, this is insane. Even if we were to admit miracles, which a miracle by definition is quite insane, and I've actually seen a couple miracles, I know they do happen. This is ridiculous. True metaphysics is actually hyper-rational. I'd like to talk about nature's duality, because nature, or natura naturans, or God, I don't care what thing people make reference to. And by the way, most people don't realize, and they've only been brought up this way, Europeans and Westerners, they think, well, you got nihilists, materialists, and atheists over here, and over here you have some form of, pick any religion, Judeo-Christianity, any other religion. You got this and this. You only got these two choices. There's actually something that's in between both of those radical extremes, and that, of course, is the monistic metaphysics of either. And once again, nothing's known except the modality of the knower. You know, what you see and how you would describe something is different than how I would see the exact same thing and describe it. I mean, this is beautiful. Someone says, oh, this is beautiful. You take it out in the sunlight, too, it also glows. You're getting UV radiation. And I'm thinking, dangerous to hold, dangerous to drink out of. So we're both looking at the same thing, but we're looking at it in a different way. Monistic metaphysics vis-a-vis the Greeks and the Indians and the Egyptians are all one and the same thing. And I'd like to actually do a brief, hopefully illuminating exposition on duality and the refutation thereof, because the cornerstone of monistic metaphysics is that there is no duality. Principle and attribute is not a duality. You would not say that light is a duality relative to what it is, i.e. the light, i.e. the principle of light, and what it does, i.e. illumination. Nobody knows what light is, neither does any scientist, and that kind of sounds ridiculous. You think, well, sure, I know what light is. You flip the switch, light comes out of the light bulb. No, you're talking about illumination. You're actually looking at the extrinsic attribute. Nothing can be known without at least one attribute. There's nothing in this universe, metaphysical, objective, material, or immaterial, or otherwise, that doesn't have at least one attribute. It's completely impossible even, and this is quite fanciful if you think about it, it kind of tickles my funny bone, is that nobody could even think of anything, imaginary or otherwise, leprechauns, unicorn, anything completely real or unreal, that doesn't have one attribute. It is completely impossible. It's one of the great impossibles. The Adi Sankara, founder of Advaita Vedanta, talked about this too. You can't even imagine it. It's totally impossible, so it's completely impossible. So the duality of principle and attribute are not demonstrable of duality, because there is none in nature. None at all, rather principle and attribute. Brahma, or the absolute, the transcendent, than avidya. Avidya is no different than saying illumination. Vidya is the ancient Pali word. Sanskrit would be vidya. Pali word for light, or gnosis, Sophia. Avidya, conventionally translated as ignorance, is no different than saying illumination. And if you think about that, you can actually understand, and this is a primer, a roadmap for understanding. People read these texts like Upadisa Sahasraya Vivachudamuni, which are two of the primary greatest books that anybody should read, translations thereof, and there are many, many translations out there. Those are the two primary texts of Advaita Vedanta, or the Upanishads, or the Nikayas, or Plotinus, or Plato, or Pythagoreans, to understanding, i.e. having a primer, a roadmap into what is being said. You know, this premise of principle and attribute, vidya and avidya. They're not two different things, they're one and the same thing. Well, one means wisdom or gnosis, and the other one means agnosis. Yeah, but we're talking about the extrinsic side of something, which is not separate from that thing, rather must be eliminated. It's like a circle that never reaches itself, which would be, of course, a vortex. You'd actually start at a point. You would never reach the point where you started at again. You'd be slightly aseparate. That aseparate line where it never meets itself would be avidya. That would be the extrinsic attribute. Or what the Greeks called it anankye. They also too called it the euristos dyas, which is indefinite dyad. That duality is not a duality at all, rather extrinsic attribute, and this is demonstrable in the Fibonacci sequence, and this is the principle and secret of incommensurability of the ancient Pythagoreans. And explaining incommensurability does take a long time, but what are the first two digits of the Fibonacci sequence? Well, they're 1 and 1. It goes 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. Well, the first two digits, 1 and 1. That second 1 is not a second 1. It is the same one as the first one, principle and attribute. There's actually, and this is where the Trinity comes from, by the way. There's a Trinity in the first 5 digits of the Fibonacci sequence. It's monad, mind, magnitude, matter, and man. I say man for saving grace of the fact that it starts with an M. That would be being, or ontos. In other words, we have the principle and the attribute, both of which are 1. First two digits of the Fibonacci sequence, 1 and 1. 2 and 3 was magnitude and matter, and the consubstantiality of both of those makes ontos, or a being. And importantly, once again, the only number missing between 1 and 5 in the Fibonacci sequence is 4, which is the number for time. Anything partakes of time partakes of death. Time is unreal, it's only a measure. That's the reason why it is not found in the Fibonacci sequence. Mother Nature is telling you right there, flat out, and every ancient culture said time is the number 4. Time is not a thing at all. There's no such thing as time. Yet these fools of relativity and quantum tell you that you can bend time. That's as silly and intellectually obnoxious as saying you could bend leprechaun farts, or you could tease the hair, the mane hair of a unicorn. I mean, a completely fanciful conceptual farce with no basis in reality regarding nature. But I'd like to get to the point of talking about the duality that we see in nature from macro to micro, and how we're all, of course, completely confused, and without having a simplex primer, nobody could read, doesn't matter how good the translation is, any texts of Advaita Vedanta, the Nikayas, Egyptian texts, Greek texts, Plato, Pythagoras, so on. You can't read it and grasp it because you don't even have a primer. You actually have to understand this incommensurable metaphysics, which is hyperlogical and hyperrational, between the principle and the attribute. I'll point out dielectric and magnetic, and I can safely say, without any type of egotism, which is a ridiculous Western concept, by the way, which didn't exist back in the day, thousands of years ago. Egoity. Completely irrational principle. That, I understand magnetism better than anybody, written a book about it and thousands of videos. Between the dielectric and the magnetic, specifically the geometry of the dielectric, is a hyperboloid of this hourglass shape. The negative geometry of a hyperboloid, of course, is a torus. Negative image of a torus is a hyperboloid. Specifically, we're talking about principal attribute here. There's no distinction between dielectric and magnetic than there is between light and illumination. No distinction between light and illumination, or dielectric and magnetic, than there is in vidya and avidya, which are synonymous with conventional primordial agnosis and the transcendent one, the absolute. Doesn't matter if you say Brahman or God, it makes no distinction one way or the other. I had an epiphany in understanding light, and it was blatantly right in front of me. It's just one of those facepalm sort of things that, light, of course, is a pulsating force vector. It is, of course, a coaxial circuit that I've said for years, but it's blatantly obvious that we're looking at a three-dimensional force vector as far as the transverse electromagnetic, whether circular or linear polarization, that makes up the transverse EM field of light. The field of light, of course, is its frequency, its wavelength. But this is nothing other than a partial toroid. It is not a spherical frequency, which, of course, is what fundamental matter is. My discovery in my equation, I posted that video last week. The principal Upanishads and Advaita Vedanta speaks of a rope snake analogy. People get scared about something that is not part of it. They would talk about the silver of a mother of pearl, but there's no silver in mother of pearl. It just looks silver, and we think silver when we look at it. When people would actually go outside to do their business in the middle of the night back in ancient India, they would see a piece of rope and they would confuse it as a snake. Sometimes people, if they're elderly, would actually have a heart attack and die from something that didn't exist. This created conceptual attribute. You can look up the rope snake metaphor of ancient India. They would see a piece of rope and think it was a snake, think they're about to be bitten. And when you're bitten back then, of course, there's no cure, there's no anti-venom. You're pretty sure you're going to suffer and die, and people would die out of sake of fear. So this thing that didn't exist was reified by human beings and is used as this metaphysical analogy for the absolute and the absolute's attribute. So anyway, getting back to the hourglass, we have the geometry of force, i.e. the toroidal geometry of magnetism, and we have the geometry of inertia, of God at rest Also, too, right here in true metaphysical rationality, at the center of this hourglass, when I turn the hourglass upside down or not, we have the sands of time that we measure from top to bottom, but right here there is no time. I know the sands are actually passing there, and if we look really close we can see it, but you can't take that analogy too far. We're looking at the geometry of inertia, or rest. The true definition of inertia, i.e. the absolute, the transcendent principle. That principle, of course, would be Tat, Brahman, the absolute, the one, the agathon, the same primordial principle of light versus illumination, of which human beings make no distinction. You say light, people never think of light. They do not. They think of illumination. They think of that which goes forth, has a frequency, lands on something, and makes it manifest. Duality of selfhood and the mere self. The same is true of the principle of liberation regarding wisdom or lack thereof between foolish or wise people. I've said many times that wisdom is just a BS word to make reference to self-proximity. Self-proximity versus what? The frequency of delusion of thinking you are that which you see in the bathroom mirror when you brush your teeth. The duality of mere self and transcendent self. This would be not a duality at all, but a complicity between principle and attribute and the confusion thereof, that one has and sees oneself and suffers likewise necessitatively by identifying with that thing in the mirror, which is namisoata, which equals anatta or anatman, is not the soul, is not who I am, and is in the case as enunciated in the Upanishads and by Advaita Vedanta, tattvamasi, that thou art, or aham brahmasmi. I am the transcendent absolute, but not I am as you see in the mirror, not the psychophysicality, but the transcendent self. The thing that you see in the mirror would be no different than magnetism. Magnetism is the dielectric field. Light is to illumination as the dielectric is to magnetic. The transcendent self is to the dielectric as is to light, as is to inertia, as is this geometry of rest. A hyperboloid, in the case of an energy geometry, is the geometry towards rest, towards inertia. Right here, which is not, there's no counter space right here, there's this little null point at the center of a hyperboloid, which is the vector and geometry towards rest, which is capacitance. True energy's definition, most people think of energy as the hyperboloid, that which manifests, but it's not. Human beings always see everything upside down and backwards. So this duality of selfhood and the mere self, i.e. the psychophysical self, Bob, Sue, Larry, yada, yada, yada. People keep asking all sorts of interesting, and I love simple questions. I think there's no such thing as a stupid question. The only stupid question is not questions asked by anybody. A lot of people, I've asked questions my entire life. People that don't ask questions are the stupid ones, actually, not the people that ask so-called stupid questions. People ask the question, what happens when we die? And the best answer to that is not an answer at all, rather a question which is a true answer. It's like, well, what makes you think you are that which dies, like the psychophysical self you see in the mirror? You are not the illumination, you are the light. You are not magnetism, you are the dielectric. You are not the attribute, you are the principle. Every branch, not my opinion, I'm not saying anything new here. This is the premise of Advaita Vedanta, the Upanishads, Upatisahasraya Vivachunamuni, the Vedas, the Nikayas, Plotinus, Numenius, Syrianus, Iamblichus, the Pythagoreans, every wise, true philosophia, true philosopher, not Kant, Hume, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, these navel-gazing Western existentialists, empiricists. These people are not philosophers at all. They're navel-gazing existentialists. So, real self, of course, is in the pulse or the thread of light. Light itself is that which people think of in terms of frequency, but that's the extrinsic side of light. People never have any thought. There's not a single person on this earth right now that has within their mind, when you say light, they don't think of light at all. They always think of illumination. Not a single person. When you say light, they never think of light. They think illumination. That's like if I keep saying dielectric, everybody on earth hasn't got a clue what dielectricity is. They think of the torus that would be the case of the transverse electromagnetic, which is the three-dimensional force vector of the coaxial circuit of light, which is nothing other than a three-dimensional force vector is just an impartial torus, by the way. Three-dimensional S-curve, i.e. the vector of the loss of energy or inertia, which necessitatively must manifest as the toroidal geometry of magnetism, or in the case of light, circular or linear polarization, the frequency and wavelength of the transverse electromagnetic pulse, which is a three-dimensional force vector because light itself pulses, and this pulsation, rarefaction, and compression is what these scientists call the photon, which of course doesn't exist at all. There's no such thing as a light particle, any more than there is such thing as a leprechaun or a unicorn. These people are atomists, they're mathematicians, they're materialists. That's the only way they think. To a hammer, everything's a nail. To an atomist, are these people wrapped up in quantum, everything is a particle. Just Mother Nature's a crazy chick that's snorting white powder and she's got a bag of magic particles. That's what these people think nature is. And nature doesn't work that way. That's highly irrational. It's illogical. It's completely nonsensical. And it certainly is an affront and a heresy against Occam's razor. On and on and on. But this duality in nature is only a misapprehension by every human being who was never taught and never taught to think this way, much less taught to use retroductive logical analysis to look at rational metaphysics and understand that there is no duality in nature. Most people don't ask themselves the big questions. They're about having fun, drinking booze, partying, making money, and I understand that. I understand the natural proclivities of humanity. There are higher pursuits, intellectual pursuits, but they're not intellectual about, thought and mentation. By higher intellectual, I shouldn't have said intellectual. I should have said noetic, actually. Unfortunately, in English, there's no distinction between mind and consciousness, or it would be chit or nous versus existential monocavinum, which translated means mentation and thought. In other words, crushing mind with mind, burning the wood between your ears, which is not conducive to either wisdom, which is self-proximity, which is theurgy, or i.e. illumination. And people don't get that. They say, well, what is self-proximity? Well, what would be, what's the opposite of dilution? This dilution is, of course, taking upon oneself attribution. It is modulation. That's the only duality, is worldly, temporal, but it is not a duality at all. It's an attribute which has consequences. When this is present, that is present, as the ancient Pali passage goes. When this is not present, then this is not present. When avidya is present, then this necessitatively manifests. There's that Greek word again, necessitatively, which the Greeks called ananke. However, necessitative doesn't do it justice as a translation. Ananke means it can't be any other way. In other words, this is natura naturans, this is Dhamma. Unfortunately, there's no translation for Dhamma either, so that's throws in another bag of snakes into the mix for people trying to translate a word that is untranslatable, unfortunately. But anyway, there is no duality in nature. But this principle and attribute is seen throughout all aspects of life. Light, principle and attribute. Dielectric and magnetic, which is the geometry of the entire universe, the torus and the hyperboloid. Dielectric and magnetic are not two different things. Magnetism is the dielectric field. That's like saying ice is the cold field of water. Look at that stuff, it's a hard ice. Say this is a piece of ice, even though it's not. Look at that, it's ice. It's hard, it's not wet, and it's not squishy like water. It's like, this is, if this was ice. Well, this is the field of cold water. It's no different than talking about magnetism. Magnetism is a dielectric field. It's a three-dimensional force vector, loss of energy or inertia. Magnetism is equal to the conventional self, is equal to illumination, is equal to avidya. This principal attribute runs throughout everything absolute, transcendent, the highest in the universe, right down to the lowest, which is life. Life is not a duality, it's a consubstantiality of principle and attribute. principle and attribute, of course, and that's the fifth of the first 5 digits of the Fibonacci sequence. First 2 being principle and attribute, second 2 being mass and magnitude, i.e. matter. Matter is just high energy light. Principle and attribute between the absolute, i.e. the agathon, and its extrinsic attribute, i.e. illumination, or avidya. And the consubstantiality of both of those is life, which is the consubstantiality between matter and spirit, i.e. life. Death is not the opposite of life, it is the end of life, where the breakup between body and spirit occurs, of course. I always laugh when people say disembodied beings. Of course, there's a euphemistic word called ghosts. Like, well, that's just ridiculous. That's like saying there's no signal if you smash the radio. People just don't think about these topics. But I wanted to make a video on assumed duality, because there isn't any duality in nature. It's just, and people have to have this legend or primer within their mind in simplex understanding, because you can't read any of these ancient texts. Yet people enjoy reading. It's like, I read it, I didn't really get it. It's like, well, if you have this primer or a road map or a legend, you know, remember old maps that had a little legend at the bottom, like wavy lines means water, this dashed line means border, you know, a little legend. You have to have that legend to be able to read these texts and get what they're saying. But without that legend, you're just reading it. It's like, I read it, I don't get it. You could have a vocabulary that's par excellence to anybody on this earth, but you have to have that legend. That's the reason why all these translations are so horrible. It's like, they're the best translator on earth. Yes, they're a really good translator, but they don't know what's being said, and that's why all their translations are horrible. Anyway, I hope you like this video. If you ever want to contact me, my email's in the description below. Any donations always warmly welcome. Hope you all have a happy Thanksgiving. You know, if you're in the United States, Thanksgiving, yay! What will I be doing for Thanksgiving? Nothing. I'd like to be doing something, but I won't be doing anything. Well, other than reading and whatnot, writing. Thank you.